Well, welcome all of you, and thank you for taking the time to hear this presentation, which I think is an important one. Hopefully you will agree. And I think you should all have received a copy of this presentation in the mail, so perhaps some of you will have had an opportunity to review its contents, and but for those who haven't, hopefully you will find this an informative presentation. I encourage you to ask questions as we go along or following the end of the presentation itself. It is important that you come away from this presentation, I think, having a much better understanding of the church's finances, your congregational givings in relation to our ministries and outreach expenditures, and as we approach Consecration Sunday next week, it is our hope, the Stewardship and Finance Ministry's hope, that you will reflect on what you hear today before making your commitment for the following year. Just by way of some quick background to the genesis, if you will, of this presentation. Really there were two factors at play. One was the congregational survey, which, as you know, in late spring, members of the congregation were invited to respond to specific questions and also to provide comments of topics of a particular interest or concern to them. And some of the feedback we received from that included a desire, an interest to better understand the church's finances, perhaps have more transparency than there has been in the past, which has really amounted to the annual meeting and the presentation of the financial statements for the past year, as well as the budget for the following year. And so there's a recognition on the Stewardship and Finance Ministry's part that we need to do a better job of keeping congregation informed of the church's finances, and so there will be a more regular exchange, if you will, of information throughout the year, and importantly, as it relates to our givings, where we stand in relation to what we had budgeted, and also our expenditures, what they actually are in relation to what we had budgeted. The second reason for making this presentation is that when the Budget Committee first met back in November of last year, there's a bit of an echo now. When we met back in November to start the work for the budget for 2013, we also took a close look at where our givings were, in particular for 2012, where they were likely to end up. And at that time we were facing a very significant shortfall in givings for the year from what we had budgeted. And as you will learn later at the annual meeting in a number of weeks' time, our givings did come in short of where we had budgeted. As many of us know, the congregation collectively responded very well, very generously in the month of December to make up that shortfall, but nonetheless we did fall short by nearly $20,000. And it's important that we all understand the significance of that as we strive to fund our ministries and outreach expenditures. With that, perhaps I will turn to the first page. I know some of you may have copies of the document with you, but hopefully the text is clear enough on the screen. The first point really requires no explanation, and hopefully you will all agree. We have an energetic, passionate ministerial team, and it's important that we support them in all their works. St Andrews is renowned for its ministry and outreach programs, and many of you participate in those programs, give of your time. There is much that goes on in the church on a weekly basis. We only had to listen carefully to what Bob had to say in the service this morning to realize how active the calendar is in any given week. The good news is we have a growing membership, and I'll speak to the numbers in the slides that follow. Increasingly diverse and young. It's an energetic, engaged congregation. You'll hear that this church is well managed operationally in terms of its finances. And as evidenced by the congregational survey, I think you'll agree that the church is consistently challenging itself. What can we do better? In what ways? How? Today, St Andrew's has an operating budget of very close to $1 million annually. That is a big, big number. And so it's very important that we all understand where that money is coming from, how it is being spent, and how we all play a part in funding that. It's also important to understand that the annual operating budget, which we present each year, does not include major capital expenditures. Now, in the past decade, over $3.5 million has been spent on the church building in terms of upkeep, its maintenance, its restoration. None of that money flows through the operating budget. Now, how have we been able to fund that $3.6 million of expenditure? Well, in large part, there's been legacies. In fact, two specifically, the Clark and Mills estates, together in excess of $3 million. Now, 8 years or so ago, there was also a capital raising campaign from the congregation. The congregation responded very well to that, very generously. That raised $750,000. So between those two legacies and the capital raising campaign, we've been able to fund the restoration work. But importantly, you should understand that has not been funded out of our annual givings. So where is the money spent? There are three broad categories. The major one is Ministries and Outreach, and I'll speak to that shortly. But that includes clergy remuneration, the music program, community witness, our donations to agencies, boarding homes ministry, as well as our givings to Presbyterian sharing. That is accounted for a little under half of our total expenditures in any given year. And throughout this presentation, I'm showing you not just at a sort of snapshot in time, but over a representative period, namely the past decade, the past 10 years. On average, 46% of our expenditures have gone towards Ministries and Outreach. Now, in 2012 specifically, that amounted to $460,000. Over the 10-year period, that has been trending higher, and there are reasons for that. And I'll speak to those. Building operations accounts for about a third of our total annual outlays. That takes care of the caretakers, the heat and utilities, the routine repairs, the running of the church building premises. Over the past 10 years, that has been trending flat. So when I speak to the church's finances being well managed operationally, that is what I mean. That expenditure has really not grown over the past 10 years. It amounted to $260,000 last year. The third category is the administration, the running of the church office, the supporting services, the equipment necessary to keep the church office running. That was $200,000 last year, and again, that's been flat over the past 10 years. If we then look at where does the money come from? Well, we all know the Heritage Trust plays a very important, significant part of the church. The Heritage Trust, together with the income from the Ely estate, that represents a little over half of our total income. In 2012, that was $450,000. Now, back in the mid-2000s, it was actually higher than that, $470,000. But as we all know, through the economic financial crisis, there were significant pressures put on the trust portfolio. It diminished in value. The grant income was more or less maintained, despite the fact that there would have been good reasons for actually bringing that grant down. But over the past 10 years, that has pretty much been flat at $460,000. Congregational givings, the major part of which are envelopes and identified, and this is what I will be speaking to in the following slides, that's represented about a third of our total income. That has increased over the past 10 years. and you will see that. The third category is rental income. We have offices upstairs which are rented out. They're fully rented out. From time to time, the Great Hall is rented out. That accounts for 12% of our income, but that's an important 12%. That last year was $110,000. And again, over the past 10 years, that income has been trending higher. So, the takeaway from this slide, the congregation is funding 1/3 of our total outlays. Where does the Ministries and Outreach money go? Well, hopefully you can see from this pie chart, you're well aware of the ministries we have: Christian education, communications, community life, Presbyterian sharing, boarding homes ministry. We have personnel relations, of course. And so that's supporting the ministerial team. And that's critical that we do support them. We have a vibrant music program that costs money. 20% of our Ministries and Outreach. I should point out that in the red type there, this is the proposed budget for 2013. This is yet to be approved, but we will be taking this budget to session and the board for their approval, and ultimately to come before the congregation, the annual meeting, seeking the congregation's approval. The budget for 2013 is $514,000. And so this, by way of the pie chart, is explaining where that money will go. Community witness is 5%. That's principally the boarding homes ministry, about which we all know. Presbyterian sharing is just a little under 20%. That was $86,000 in 2012. It'll be roughly that again in 2013. Important to note, however, that back in 2003 was $98,000. Now, the reason it's lower today is the decision was taken back then in 2004 with the congregation's approval that the amount that we give in respect to Presbyterian sharing should be reduced to $70,000. And it was decided that because we had sustained a large deficit in 2003 of about $80,000. So something had to give. The congregational givings weren't there to support the outgoings. There's a very strong desire that we get it back to the levels that we were at. We're making progress, but we're not there yet, 10 years later. Slide 5. How much do we really contribute to Ministries and Outreach? Now, in the past 3 years, those of you who have attended the annual congregational meeting will have heard me speak about the church's finances looking in two broad categories. The running and the financing of the operations, and the running and the financing of the Ministries and Outreach. And I've explained to you how we can look upon the Heritage Trust and the Ely Estate income, together with the rental income we receive from the offices in the Great Hall, as essentially paying for the upkeep of the building, the running and maintenance of the building. So it pays for all the administration. What does that mean? It means that all of our givings can go towards Ministries and Outreach. Every dollar of our givings goes towards Ministries and Outreach. But if we look at this slide here, graphically, I think you'll take away from this that our givings each and every year have fallen short of what we spend on Ministries and Outreach. Over the past 10 years, look upon it as for $3 that we spend on Ministries and Outreach, we, the congregation, fund just $2 of that. And so as we walk away from this presentation, we should all challenge ourselves, how can we make up that shortfall? How can we fund $3 of every $3 we spend on Ministries and Outreach? Because we're not there yet. Just to put some dollar amounts to that, last year, that gap was $160,000. How is this shortfall being funded? Well, a lot of words on this page, but it comes down to three sources. The Heritage Trust. It's averaged $460,000, I mentioned earlier, in each of the past 10 years. It's important also that we understand that it was primarily intended to support the upkeep of the building when that trust was established. It was our hope and our dream that congregational contributions would make it unnecessary to rely upon the trust for ministerial support. That remains a hope and a dream. It is not reality, but we have to make it a reality. The trust performed very well last year. It's managed well by Burgundy Asset Management. The return last year was 12%, which is very encouraging. It or at the end of December, it stood at about $7.5 million. That's a big number. We all know that. But we're drawing income from it each and every year that I suggest to you is greater than should be warranted. We're using a portion of that trust and its income to fund what we're not funding ourselves. We need to ensure that the capital of the trust grows and maintains its value in real dollar terms. I mentioned earlier we spent over $3.5 million on restoring the building, the upkeep of it, over the past 10 years. That didn't come from the trust per se. It came from two legacies as well as the capital raised through the congregation. But just think for a minute, had we had to draw on the trust without the benefit of any legacies, where that trust value would be today. And think again, how much income could we then draw from it? We have to make bigger efforts to allow that trust to continue to grow. And that, I believe, means that we have to look less to the trust for our annual income to help support our expenditures. Rental income I've mentioned, we get a little over $100,000. That too has helped support up the shortfall in our givings in relation to our ministries and outreach expenditures. A couple of years ago, the congregation approved a ministerial staffing fund. This was a portion of the Milnes Estates money that was set aside to be managed by the Heritage Trust, an amount of $300,000. And this was in recognition of the fact that as we increased our ministerial staffing, given the need in that regard, it was a recognition that the congregation couldn't be expected to fund that increased ministerial staffing team day one. There was going to be a transitionary period, and so it would be necessary to draw from this fund on an annual basis to make up the shortfall in those givings. And we had no specific time frame in mind, although there was talk that maybe this was a sort of 5-year transitionary period. Last year, 2012, we will have drawn $35,000 from that fund. The proposed operating budget for 2013 indicates that we will need to draw somewhere between $50,000 and $55,000 from that fund. Now just extrapolate that a year or two, and before you know it, we will have drawn down that fund in a few years' time. Then where will we be? How much do we really give? There are lots of numbers on this page. I don't make any apology for that, but hopefully you will walk away from here having a better understanding of where we are in terms of our givings. And I'll try and explain what some of these lines and bars mean. But first of all, the yellow bars. So again, this is over a 10-year period, and the numbers at the bottom of each of those bars represent the total number of visits, people, head count, if you will, that have passed through the doors in any given year on a Sunday service. Now, the dip you see there in 2006, 2007, well, as we know, our previous senior minister, Cameron Brett, retired. There was a vacancy as the search was on for his successor. And the good news, of course, is that Will arrived in September of 2008, and we've seen a very healthy pickup in the numbers of people in the pews on any given Sunday service. So that explains that. Now, as for the lines themselves, what do these represent? Well, if we look upon our total congregational givings and bring that down to what do they represent per attendee, I'll call it, any person in the year, that was $36. And we follow the blue line, and you can see the one on the top. That's over the years, that trended higher. In fact, it peaked at $45 per attendee in 2008. But it's since come off a bit. It stabilized in 2012, but it's $39. Now, what does the red line mean? Well, if we think back to 2003, we were giving $36. In 2003 dollars, we're actually giving less today, $32. So I ask you to consider, let's just put it in plain terms, whatever our income was, or our salary was that we might be earning in 2003, 10 years on, would we be happy if we were earning just the same amount? Or would we have expected to receive some annual increase, recognizing there's inflation each and every year? It's been somewhat muted in recent years, but nonetheless, we might have expected some increase. This is saying that in real dollars, we're actually giving less today than we were 10 years ago. And we need to fix that. Because if I take you from 2008, we had about 6,500 attendees in the year. We're 1,000 people more than that today. And yet our givings have barely budged in aggregate. Why is making a commitment so hard? Well, as we think about next Sunday, I invite us all to reflect on some of these facts. At last year's pledging, we had 79 commitments made. That's broadly representative of the numbers of commitments we've had in prior years. And collectively, an amount of $177,000 was pledged from those 79 commitments. Our budget for Ministries and Outreach for 2012 was $472,000. We've actually come in a little less than that this past year, but our budget was $472,000. So the commitments that we had received early on in the year represented less than 40% of what we were actually budgeting to spend. Now, you could call it a mistake, perhaps, in setting the budget before we've received commitments, but nonetheless, think if we were to set the budget based on commitments, how different our Ministries and Outreach expenditures might be. We're hoping that we receive more in any given year, and indeed we do. You can look at the envelopes. We actually received 167 envelopes. Now, it's a bit of an archaic term, perhaps, in this day and age when people are more and more comfortable making donations by credit card. We have the power plan. So it's unrealistic to expect that everyone is going to come on a Sunday and put money in an envelope. But read envelopes are being taxed. People receive a tax receipt, and it amounts to the same thing. So we did much better. Although we had 79 commitments, we actually had 167 people giving and getting a tax receipt. But why is it that less than half of all those who actually give and receive a tax receipt actually make a commitment at the very outset? So we did better. Although 177,000 was pledged, we actually received 261,000. Now, there are other givers identified who receive tax receipts, and they collectively gave 45,000. So last year we received 300,000. The number there, 316, includes 16, which was a make-up for the deficits that have been sustained in the 2 prior years. And we thank the generosity of those members of the congregation who rallied to support that special campaign to make up that deficit. But again, we need to ask ourselves, why is it so difficult to make a commitment? This is not a legal obligation, not a promise. No one's going to harass you, come after you. Why did you not honour the pledge you made? But it is an invitation to us all, I think, to consider making a pledge. A lot of numbers on this page, again, for which I make no apology. This will be new information to many of you, and I will stress and say at this very outset, I do not know the names of these givers. It's important you understand that. This is not an exercise in naming and shaming in any way. But I think this is a revelation in many ways. We are overly dependent on a very few number of givers. Think if one were to pass away, leave the church, whatever, the loss of that income. In cold numbers, lose those top two givers, we need another sort of 400 members of congregation who are giving at the bottom there. The facts speak for themselves. They are what they are. There's no sort of colouring here or mollycoddling this message. 25% of our envelope givers gave less than $5 a week. The average is $2.20 a week. That does not buy you an extra small cup of coffee and a donut from Tim Hortons. And on it goes. 40% less than $10 a week, 52% less than $15 a week. Now, I will say, for some, for many, perhaps, they're giving what they can give. I say this is not intended to name or shame, but it is intended to shed some light upon, where we're all at, and hopefully reflecting on this, each of us finding a way of responding to this call, if you will, to find it in ourselves to perhaps help support ministries and outreach more than we are doing today. So what if? Again, a lot of numbers on this page. In 2012, I've said we had envelope and identified givings of 300,000. Our ministries came in at 460,000, so we funded 65%, so 2 of every $3. We have 167 envelopes today, roughly. If we just kept with 167 envelopes, if all of those envelope givers were able to give an extra $5 a week, what would that mean? Well, it would mean another 43,000 of income. So we would be working our way towards reducing that gap, the shortfall. An extra $10 a week clearly makes more of a difference. That would be an extra $87,000 of income. So we're now funding 3/4 of our ministries and outreach budget. But supposing we could have more envelope givers, challenge ourselves. If that number were 200, well, on top of the givings today, if we had another $5 a week from 200 envelopes, that's $50,000 more of income. An extra $10 a week, we're over $100,000 of additional givings and funding nearly 80% of our ministries and outreach. So we're not there yet, even with an extra $100,000 of givings. But we're making progress. The final slide, entitled Setting Ourselves Goals and Objectives. As we walk away from here, I invite us all to consider these goals and objectives and see if we can each in turn find a way of supporting these goals and objectives. Goal number 1, every congregational member should make a financial commitment, no matter the size. Again, less than half of envelope givers making a commitment. It's hard to understand why people would not. Second goal, importantly, is that the congregational giving should match our ministries and outreach expenditures. I say again, we need to rely less on the Heritage Trust. I believe we're drawing too much from that trust on an annual basis, and we can't expect that there will be legacies. We imagine there might be, but we shouldn't rely on that and assume that. We have to ensure that the trust capital is allowed to grow. So the Stewardship and Finance Ministry is proposing these following objectives. that we raise the number of envelope givers from 167 to strive for at least 200 in the near term. And that our commitments as a percent of envelope givers should grow from the 48% they are today to at least 75% within the next year or two. In some ways, there's really no good reason why it shouldn't be 100% today. Let's assume it's 75% at least. In congregational givings, we need to get to at least $375,000 in the next year or two to show meaningful progress towards funding that shortfall and also working our way towards being self-sufficient when the ministerial staffing fund is eliminated. Over the medium term, 3 to 5 years, we have as an objective $500,000 at a minimum. Now, to say that 3 to 5 years, our Ministries and Outreach budget for next year is $514,000. So that wouldn't be fully funding the Ministries and Outreach. We want to set ourselves realistic objectives, ones that we feel are all attainable. We want 100% participation. And we all hope, of course, that the congregational numbers will grow, and that in turn will help us. So, as I say, we need to rely less on the Heritage Trust for our income. And I think all the recent work on the building serves as a reminder of why we need to ensure that capital grows and that we don't draw more from it than is necessary. The Ministerial Staffing Fund, as I say, was established to help us through a transitionary period with a view to the congregation fully supporting the ministerial team. We did not achieve that last year. As I said, our givings collectively were $20,000 below budget. We headed in the opposite direction from where we need to be. So, in closing, I would say that this has been perhaps a sobering message, but I hope one that you reflect on and can see there's a way in which we can work towards collectively helping to fund that shortfall. It can be done. There's a lot of new information provided here. I understand that. Some of which may be confusing, maybe not, hopefully not. But I think with this information, it will allow you to perhaps put in context the importance of your contribution, your individual contributions, your pledges. And I ask you, invite you to reflect on that in this message for next Sunday. Thank you, and with that, I'm happy to take questions.